Ben Burgis. He's author of Give Them an Argument, Logic for the Left. It's an incredible book that everybody should be reading, and it's doing incredibly well. Let's keep it climbing up the Amazon charts. We share a publisher, Zero Books. My book is getting a hell of a lot closer, and next week I am going to announce, along with this new co-host, the name and title of the book. So coming along, Ben Burgis, welcome to the Debunk, my friend.
So the new co-host isn't just you wearing a wig like Anthony Perkins dressed up as Granny Bates at the end of Psycho, is it?
No, but that's a weird reference. I was thinking you were going to try to go for a Crowder jab.
Yeah, I was going to say
I thought it was a Crowder joke.
Crowder's trying to liquidate all of his his cross-dressing outfits.
Yeah. I'm actually writing Crowder to see if I could have all of his addresses because of his
Might need to save some money soon.
Yeah, Steve might need to be, and I guess he might be ending his totally not in any way bigoted or terrifyingly psychologically revealing cross-dressing bits.
Yeah, no, that's good. I noticed that YouTube has gone through his videos and decided that apparently none of them were as bad as that video that we did for Zero Books, mildly criticizing Ben Shapiro.
Right, exactly. Yeah. Well, capitalism and fascism, brother. But we got to get to tonight's debunk. What is the debunk, Ben? What are we debunking? What are we talking about? It's a different one. I believe it involves a guy that I don't know, but I from what I've seen, I don't have the same politics, but I like him. It doesn't, usually we're debunking a lot of real cretins here. This is a different ball game tonight.
Yeah, no, this guy is definitely not a cretin. So this is Destiny, who is a Twitch stream gamer who has debated a lot of right wingers and has actually really done some very good work in that regard. But as you say, he doesn't have our politics. And the other night, I had a very friendly and civil and constructive conversation with him about socialism, and you could see that on the Serfs, the YouTube channel, the Serfs.
I will be appearing on the Serfs next week.
Nice,
good guys, good Canadians.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so.
And in the clip we're about to hear, he's making an argument, or really he's making an objection to the kind of consideration that I bring up a lot, I've heard you bring up a lot, about why one of the most important reasons why we need to democratize the economy, which is about the ecological impact of the current economic system. And I think that it's an important thing to look at, not because as you say this is a much better person than most of the people that we debunk, but because it's inherently interested and because this is an incredibly important subject.
Absolutely. So let's play this clip and then we'll throw it back to you. And this is a Twitch stream, so you guys are playing video games together or something?
Well, he's playing video games. I'm almost 40. I think the last video game I played was Frogger.
Okay, because I've been on Twitch and seen Twitch, but I don't totally understand the setup. But anyways, go for it.
Sure, but socialism, like co-ops or whatever, none of that has anything to do with the environment either, though, right? Like, there's no reason to think that like a co-op or whatever would do anything more to address environmental issues than a free market.
Well, maybe not. Like, here's why I think that it might help. I think that if you have large numbers of people, who are directly affected, oftentimes by these, by pollution, for example, by these questions, who are in a position to have democratic input into decision making, especially. I mean, I don't know the number off the top of my head, but,
Yeah, but, like,
I think
what you're
I think that there's an estimate that there's some really small number of companies in the world that are directly responsible for some massive chunk of global climate change.
Sure.
And so if you have, like, one of those companies, even if it wasn't nationalized, even if it was run as a private, cooperative, if you're talking about, like, many thousands of employees, and they don't necessarily have the sort of huge stake in the existing practices of the company that they would have if they were like major stockholders in a private company, then I think that I'm much more optimistic. The more democratic input there is into the system and people's ability to say, hey, do we want to be able to expand a little bit faster, or do we want our grandchildren to be able to live on this planet? That I'm much more confident that
You say that now, but like we already have a democracy, and there's already what percentage of Americans that don't even believe that climate change is real. Like these would be the same people in the workplaces voting on whether or not we should do it, right? Like Trump said literally like that climate change is a hoax from China. Like all of the people that voted for him, which were a lot of worker type people, right? The whole Rust Belt that kind of swung for him. These would be the people in charge of voting in their workplaces on whether or not we should do something about climate change. So I mean, I guess I'm not fully sold on the idea, and this is where kind of like I'm very inflammatory on Twitter. I don't know which tweets you read, but like I said multiple times, like workers are dumb or whatever. I don't necessarily mean that like workers are like a class, like a genetically bred to be stupid people or whatever. But I think in general, like people seem to be like pretty clueless about issues. And this isn't just workers. This is like all sorts of different people for a variety of reasons too, right? Whether we don't fund education, whether you're on a lower class and you didn't have time to pay attention to that shit, for whatever reason. That the idea that like the same people that voted for Trump, if they were in charge of co-ops, they would just magically be more aware or more caring about climate issues. I don't know. I find that really, really hard to believe.
I just have to say, I continue to like Destiny from the interactions I've had with him, and I am going to continue in the vein of my meditation retreat, but I am just going to say, not good. All right, go ahead.
Yeah, so one thing, by the way, that's worth flagging about that I didn't really think about until I watched this again in preparation for the segment, is that he is really overstating working class support for Trump in the Rust Belt. Right. That like this is a very minor point, but if you actually look at the election results in places like Michigan and Wisconsin, it's not that there was some great working class surge of support for Trump. It's mostly just that traditional Democratic constituencies didn't come out and vote for Hillary. So that's just that's a small point, but I think it's one worth emphasizing if we're going to make big generalizations about people's views about climate change and other things. But I think that it is an important, it's a really important point to address because, the global climate change is one of the most important reasons that we need to move towards a more democratized economic system. And I think there are a few, in the moment when I was responding to it, actually your first guest, Hassan Piker, when he was talking about the debate on his stream last night, he kind of faulted me for going a little too easy on him at this point, on Destiny at this point.
Yes, you should have ripped it. I like Destiny. You know what? I can be a good politician. I like Destiny. Destiny's a friend of mine. He's a great guy. You should have fucking torn his head off for that shit, dude.
Yeah, so what I did point out, which is an important point to make, is that any strategy that anybody could propose for doing anything about global climate change is going to have to involve having a majority, convincing the majority of the population this is a serious problem. And a lot of progress has already been made on that front, because unless you have a massive majoritarian coalition in favor of doing something about it, then regardless of the economic system, nothing's going to happen. But under socialism, you do have more levers of power that you can use in order to do something, because under capitalism, the vast majority of the power structure is not up for election. We like the general public or even the employees don't get to elect the CEO of ExxonMobil. And a good point that Hassan did make in his commentary on it, which I did refer to, like you could hear it in the clip, but maybe I soft pedaled the point, is that very oftentimes the employees of these companies are actually themselves directly impacted by these bad environmental practices. Think about fracking and and what fracking does to like groundwater in communities where the people who actually work for these companies live. And I think that's absolutely true. Now, we do need to disaggregate that from subtler environmental impacts, like just sort of gradually eroding the ozone layer, where you don't necessarily have that immediate incentive for employees, even in a worker-owned company, to go against these practices. But even there are a few things that are really worth hammering on. One of those is that in the more people that you have who are able to make this decision, and the less direct financial stake each of them has in maintaining these practices, the better your chances of doing something about it. And especially because oftentimes, when coal miners, for example, have this tremendous incentive not to want to support regulations that would lead to their jobs going away, it's because the alternatives under the existing system are you have the job that you have now, or you have an uncertain future that might involve living in poverty. And so if we change those options, so people had more choices, they weren't afraid of living in poverty and not having any job at all if they transitioned to some other line of work, then that would be less true. And then the last point I want to make about this is one that Bhaskar Sankara makes in his excellent new book, The Socialist Manifesto, which is that if we nationalized banking as part of a transition to a more democratic economy, then public banks, we could set as a matter of public policy when we were looking at which kinds of cooperative enterprises public banks gave starter loans to, what the environmental impacts are going to be, and that's something that's like very direct that we could do to curb these issues that there's no equivalent that we can do under capitalism.
100%. I just want to add two things though. All right. So one, I think it's a really common belief that a lot of people have, but first, complicating the numbers, right? Like, no, Donald Trump was not, he was able to make statistically significant inroads in geographically vital areas, right? So we already know that. But no, his base is not working class. In fact, his base has a higher than average national income. And if we talk about working class properly, which would mean covering every single member of the working class across all demographics, overwhelmingly voted against Trump, so that doesn't hold water. Then, being informed, like, we got to complicate that. And also not just because it's like, oh, you can't say that and let's be politically correct. There's plenty of people across class backgrounds that are not quote unquote informed, right? That's true. But then what does informed actually mean? Paulo Freire was a big influence on me. He wrote Pedagogy of the Oppressed. And he was a Brazilian educator, worked in the 60s and 70s, and he educated like people who were illiterate, because of lack of schooling and things like that. And he would do things like teach them to read by using the newspaper and actually engaging them in the things that were affecting their lives and depriving them. And he said, like, it's not like people don't understand the structures that inhibit them. So when people say something like that, I literally don't know what that means, because I'm very willing to say that somebody is being dumb or off base, regardless of where they're coming from. It's not like, oh, don't say that. But on the flip side, if your definition of informed is, well, this amount of people know who the Senate Majority Leader is and blah, 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 that's not informed. That doesn't mean you have any understanding of the actual forces that are driving politics and economics. And I will say, in my anecdotal experience, a lot of people from working class backgrounds definitely have a much more innate understanding of that stuff. And that's not because they're better people or more moral or whatever. It's just because if you live in a certain way, you have to fucking understand institutions more. That's just reality.
Yeah,
your daily life
experience shoved in your face.
Yeah, you're dealing with this stuff. It's totally unmediated. And then the second point I would say is like, if your starting point, like I agree with you, people do need to accept and understand the climate crisis to act on it. But if your starting point of why we're not doing something about the climate crisis is people don't believe the science versus Exxon, you have the wrong starting point of analysis. And in fact, I would argue that while public opinion is 100% necessary, you could get to a point if you don't have actual mobilization and a power change, you could have 99% of the population accepting the science and having the right view, and it will make not a goddamn bit of difference because powerful multinational companies and our entire economy is designed on fossil fuels. And that doesn't fucking matter whether or not you are, and again, let's be real here. We're all, we're not climate scientists. We read in the popular literature and we make smart assessments, but that's not the point. And even if you're really preoccupied with people being misinformed on the science, well, I got to tell you, the reason they are most likely is because Exxon and Chevron and DuPont secretly funded scientists and fake organizations to generate lies and propaganda to misinform the public. So even if you're hung up on, well, these people just don't know the numbers. Well, I'm sorry, my friend. You got to go back to the capitalism again. It's unescapable. People's beliefs and public opinion is a second order thing. Sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And really, I think this is like what it is. This is, I think, a pretty common view for like a certain kind of liberal who might,
Yes.
like even people like, Destiny, who, like has a lot of good, progressive.
He has legitimately has a lot of good politics. Absolutely. Yep.
Yeah. But like a lot of people who see the world through more of that liberal kind of lens, ultimately it's a very idealist way of seeing the world. The same way that a lot of conservative views are very idealist, like in the philosophical sense of idealism, like they have like that ideas are primary, that like the sort of source of the problem is people having bad ideas in their heads rather than the fundamental point of analysis being material. And this is really important. And like, I think this is actually a pretty simple, pretty straightforward illustration of that, because it's one thing to say, of course, yes, that is bad and it does contribute to the problem, and it's because obviously in order to mobilize people to do anything about it, they have to realize that climate change, is really happening and is a problem, and et cetera. But the fact that people have this wrong idea that like there's whatever percentage of the public it is that believes that it's not real, like even if you want to be like they're too gullible, whatever, okay. But as you say, that's a second order thing. The question isn't like, oh, should they be better at like sorting through media to tell when they're being lied to or whatever. The question is, who told them this lie, right? Why is it that they right. believe that they have this bad idea in particular? And that's because, as you say, ExxonMobil and Fox News and there's this extremely well-funded propaganda machine with many heads that has been relentlessly dedicated to pushing this particular lie.
That's it. And that has to be your starting point. I mean, yeah. I mean, people look up the tobacco industry as another example of this. I mean, your starting point must be where the power is. And the power is not in regular people, having bad beliefs or not understanding something. It is a problem, but it is not the origins of anything. It isn't. Period. Ben, as always, much appreciated. You'll be back in studio next week, I believe, along with Bhaskar. Double header.
Yeah. Looking forward to it.
All right, brother. Thank you. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.